I always sort of relish the chance to come talk to education reporters because, as Scott pointed out, I've spent probably more of my career writing about schools than anything else. I still think of myself sometimes or some ways as an education writer, um, uh, but uh, but I'm always grateful to get a chance to hanging with you guys instead of opinionators or other reporters. Um, so I was talking to Scott before about what what they wanted me to talk about today, and I had gotten a couple notes about we'll just talk about Detroit and talk about DPS, our public school system here. Scott said, just give them a general sense of the chaos that that you encounter here. And I think that's a good word, and that's a good place to start. And when I talk about schools here now, um, I don't just talk as a reporter or a commentator. I was an education reporter here in Detroit 20 years ago, um, and I've covered schools in Kentucky and a little bit in Chicago and in Baltimore also. But when I was an education writer, I never had children. Um, Now I'm back here writing about all kinds of things, but also our schools, and I'm a parent. And so, totally different perspective, right? I've got two elementary school age children who are growing up in the city here. And so, school is something that I deal with constantly. Right now, I have a fifth grader who's going to leave elementary school and go to middle school next year. And for most people in this city, um, I think they could tell you that that's when the public options really run out in a very frightening and sudden way that for any number of reasons people choose other things. Um, so in the middle of that, at the same time, I'm thinking about how to give some sort of overview of what's going on here. So I'm going to start with that word chaos, because that is what I feel like we sort of have created here over a very long period of time. Um, I think if you ask officials at the state level, they will say that we ruined our schools here locally with bad decision making and corruption and overindulging unions and things like that. I think if you ask people here, they would say the state ruined our schools. When the state first took over DPS in the late 90s, that things were headed in the right direction and that the state oversight is what ruined it. I think if you ask unions, they'll tell you that it was administrators who ruined our schools. If you asked administrators, they would say it was teachers. The short answer to all of those things is they are all right and they are all tragically wrong. We have done this together in this community over my entire lifetime. The truth is, I was born here in 1970, and my parents would not send me to the public schools in Detroit. That's not just a generation ago anymore. I'm ashamed to admit that's more than a generation ago. They didn't feel like there were enough quality options, or that the kind of education they wanted from me was going to be available in public schools. So this is not a new problem at all, and there is nobody who is blameless in the situation. So I want to give some sort of overview of what we're facing right now, and then sort of talk about what I think are some of the things we need to sort of change. Right now, Detroit Public Schools have about 42 to 45,000 children in them. When I covered the district in 1994, there were 181,000 kids. So more than double, more than triple the size. Um, uh, the that number has dropped steadily since about 2000, 2001. It reflects a couple of things. One is the exodus of people from the city. Detroit lost 250,000 people between 2000 and 2010. But as the state was managing the schools in the late 90s and early 2000s, people really started to panic, I think, a little about what was happening and what direction things were headed. And so people started pulling their kids out. At the same time, Michigan's charter school law had sort of opened the floodgates to opportunities for other kinds of schools to siphon off kids from DPS. And our charter law is different from the laws that you may have in the states where you are from. It's a wide open, sort of Wild West kind of thing. If I wanted to open a school next year, I could probably get a charter with no real track record of ever having run schools, very little planning, and frankly, very little proof that I could fund it. It's not a well-regulated system at all. It is very sort of wide open, and it is not tempered at all by demand or need. So we see new charter schools open all the time in Detroit, even though we know the population here is shrinking. And we have so many charter schools. In fact, there are almost 50,000 kids in the charter schools here in Detroit. There are more kids there than there are in DPS. At the same time, there are 20,000 extra seats in the schools in DPS, charter, and then EAA, which is another kind of district that I'll talk about in a minute. So we've got this sort of massive overcapacity and dwindling population that has made it impossible for the public schools really to recover and to sort of stabilize. They continue to lose children every year. This may be the first year, I think, that they may see that bottom out a little bit. And when they lose children, they lose money. And so it's very difficult if you're a public school system. You've got all this infrastructure. You've got a system that was built for almost 200,000 kids. It's very difficult to sort of make that match the number of kids you have when you're losing. For a while, they were losing 10,000 kids a year. And it's not like you were losing them in one part of the city or another. It was everywhere. And so you had schools that had to stay open to serve kids in that neighborhood, but were at no more than 40 or 50% capacity. The EAA is the third district that exists here in Detroit, and that's a new school district, or newish school district that the state started a few years ago. They took the 15 lowest performing schools and said, lowest performing over a long period of time, and said, look, we're going to try to create a turnaround district, a place where these schools can get different kinds of attention and try to do better. Of course, that's not a new idea. Lots of states have tried that. Lots of school districts have tried that. But of course, in Michigan, we had to try it and not do it very, very intelligently. There have been a number of problems with the way those schools are structured. They are not getting the kind of resources that you would expect for the lowest performing schools. These are the kids who need the most attention and the most help. And they're not getting it. And so, so you've got these three systems serving about 100,000 kids, and all three of them, by almost any measure, are failing. If you look at test scores, if you look at graduation rates, if you look at retention and things like that, it's just not, it's not serving anybody. And most people are choosing, based. The other big problem is that we don't have, as parents in this city, a wonderful or even accessible way to assess these schools. There is no single sort of measure that says this is a good school, that's a bad school. You have this sort of raw marketplace competition that goes on every year where the public schools and the EAA schools and the charter schools all fight over the dwindling number of kids, and they do it by the crudest measures they can come up with. I mean, I can't tell you how frequently in July or August you'll hear commercials here on the radio, and they'll say, sign up for our school and you get a free laptop, or sign up for our school this year, we're teaching Mandarin. I'm not sure why that is such an appealing dynamic. But there is no, those aren't true measures, of course, of any sort of quality. And so parents here are left largely to fend for themselves and to choose from among sort of equally poor options. It's been that way here, as I pointed out, for some time. I mean, the schools were better when I was a kid than they are now, and we had schools here that you could choose. You know, we had very, very high quality high school magnets, 2 high school magnets here that were sort of famous for maintaining quality and attracting kids. But sort of as a whole, the system has not worked. The system hasn't worked for as long as I've been alive. And again, as a parent, my children right now go to a charter school in the Midtown Center section of town. It's a very good elementary school. It does have high scores and things like that, and it's got the kind of curriculum we wanted, and we're getting the kind of outcomes we want. At middle school, there won't be that choice, and so we will opt out of the system like so many other people do. I could tell a lot of sort of sensational stories about Detroit, things that happen here that you would never see happen other places, and I sort of hesitated to sort of mark down to say those things because I think they don't always portray the sort of mundane and ordinary difficulty that we have with schools here, and I think they sort of distract. But there is one example I wanted to give that I heard from an organization called Excellent Schools Detroit, which is sort of a nonprofit consortium of different interests, all trying to establish a better way to measure how our schools are doing, disseminate that information to parents, and then hold schools accountable for their performance. But the last time I was speaking to a group of education reporters, someone from Excellent Schools Detroit was there too, and he told a story about a charter school that opened and within 6 weeks ran out of money and closed, and sent the kids who were there scattered all through the district. Nobody knew quite where they went. I asked him after he gave the presentation, I said, who was the charter authorizer for that school? And he said it was DPS. It was the public school system that chartered a school that closed within 6 weeks. And I think that right there sort of captures that word that I started with, chaos. There are lots and lots of examples of the public schools and the charter schools not serving the interests of parents or teachers or kids here, which sort of leaves you to ask whose interests they are serving. I wanted to then talk about some of the things that I think are our problems here and things that we might do differently, and then I'll take some questions. I think our biggest problem here is governance. and our obsession with governance. As long as I can remember, the fight in Detroit has been about who will control the schools here. Will it be the elected board? Will it be the governor? Will it be, we've had a sort of transitional board. We've tried lots of different things, and the argument always comes back to who's got their hands on the wheel. And some of that is about the, the sort of struggle that we have here as Detroiters with that kind of self-identity in a larger sense. This is a place that's got a very proud tradition of independence, and that independence has shifted from sort of living with a sort of white ethnic identity to living with an African American identity, and an African American identity that is often at odds with the rest of the state. That plays out over and over in our schools. That the idea that somebody may come and take our schools from us sort of drives us to fight over that governance question in ways that don't make any difference. I mean, we've been arguing about this for years now, and the schools are not better; they are worse, and they are crumbling because we can't sort that out. We got to stop talking about governance. You know, as a parent, I don't go to a school and ask, well, who's the person running the school? Who's the board that's in charge of this school? What I ask about is what goes on in the classroom and what results the school is getting. And I think most parents respond that way. I think we have to sort of change the way we talk about our schools from that who's going to be in charge to what's going to happen in the classrooms. The other thing we've got to do here is we've got to rationalize the system by which we create and maintain schools. There is no incentive built into the system now for a school to have to perform at a high level in order to stay open. We have lots and lots of public schools that have been open forever and don't serve kids. We have almost all the charter schools, and that there may be someone in the audience who would quibble with that, but nearly all of our charter schools in the city are about as bad as the public schools, which, you know, the question then is, why do they stay open, or why are they allowed to stay open, or who's enforcing some accountability to make them get better or close. The Free Press, Lori Higgins is one of our reporters at the Free Press, and she and lots of other people at the paper just completed a very large project that talked about this charter school system and that we've created and how unaccountable it is, how out of control it is. And we came up with lots of very concrete suggestions for improving that, things that we borrowed from other states, probably states that you guys are from. We'll have an epic battle over that in the legislature. I mean, it's just not an easy, it's not an easy ask, but until we do that, Detroit's not going to get any better. And so we've got to deal with this sort of charter school question. But then the other thing we've got to do is we've got to stop distinguishing between the kinds of schools. You know, something like the EAA was a great idea in concept, but part of the reason it failed was that it created this other kind of school that then was sort of on its own and by definition was seen as being at odds with the public schools and with the charter schools and was another competitor. I'm not sure what purpose that serves. What difference does it make whether it's an EAA school or a charter school or a DPS school? We do need to sort of start thinking of schools as just schools and dealing with them in one way under one sort of model. The other thing we've got to do, and I talk about this a lot now that I'm a parent, and this is something that I wouldn't have said when I was just covering schools. because I don't think I would have understood it. But so the population here in Detroit is not just overwhelmingly African American. It's been that way since I was a kid. But what's changed is that it is overwhelmingly impoverished. The middle class in the city, which used to also be heavily African American, has almost all disappeared. What that means is that we have schools that are dealing with, with numbers that you wouldn't see in terms of their poverty index anywhere else. You have schools whose free and reduced lunch percentage is 80, 90, 95%. And that's pretty consistent across not just the public schools, but also the charter schools. The charter schools, on average, have lower free and reduced lunch percentages than the public schools do. But when I say lower, it's like 65 or 70% instead of 85 or 90%. So the difference is not significant or dispositive. There's no such thing as a system that is able to serve that many kids who live in that kind of isolated poverty at a high level consistently. I mean, it just doesn't work. And so it creates a number of problems, but one of the problems is for families like mine, by the time your kids are 11 or 12 years old and going into middle school, I'm starting to think about who the children are that my kids will be competing with for the rest of their lives if they go to college and things like that. And those kids don't exist in the system here. They don't go to the public schools. They are not in the charter schools. And so, so the choice that I end up having to make is to take them and put them into a pretty expensive private school where those kids are. I think until we can attract back a reasonable number of those kids, it's going to be very difficult to make DPS work, or the charter schools, or EAA. I mean, that's a problem that the city has. I tell this story a lot too. My kids started school in Baltimore. They started kindergarten and first grade there. And we lived in the city there as well. We could not get our kids into the neighborhood school in our neighborhood in Baltimore because it was oversubscribed. In that neighborhood now, if you have a kid, you need to get that kid on the wait list when it's born to get into the public school in that neighborhood. And there are about 6 schools around Baltimore where that's true. Those schools are oversubscribed with middle-class families who have moved back to the city or never left, and who send their kids to those schools, and that creates an entirely different dynamic, not just in that school, but then in the schools around it, which are getting some of the spillover. We don't have that here. There's not a school in Detroit that you could say that about, and in Baltimore, it creates all kinds of problems, and people get upset and threaten and all these kinds of things when they can't get into schools. But there is a healthy side of that competition that is also really important, and that's what we don't have. That's what we don't have here. So those are some of the things I feel like we've got to address here. I could probably go on for about 2 hours with a bunch of other things that we could address. I learned yesterday, for instance, we've lost all these kids in the schools, which means lots of schools have closed. We have 100 empty school buildings in the city of Detroit that still owned by the school system, which of course won't sell them to charter schools because that's creating competition, so they hang on to them. So, in a city that has 70,000 abandoned houses and other structures, it also has 100 empty school buildings. You talk about blight, we've got government creating blight here through the public school system. So, like I said, I could go on for days talking about these weird sort of dynamics that crop up around here, but I'm going to stop and I'm going to take some questions.